Whispers echoed through the sterile corridors of Northwestern Memorial's elite VP wing long before he actually arrived. Arthur Callahan, the ruthless head of Chicago's most feared crime syndicate, was bleeding out. For 11 grueling years, following a betrayal that left him with severe nerve damage and paralyzing hippophobia, Arthur hadn't let a single human being touch his bare skin. Doctors were terrified. Enforcers were threatening executions. But nobody expected that the one person to finally break through the Mafia boss's impenetrable defenses would be a severely overweight, notoriously overlooked night shift nurse. Fluorescent lights buzzed a low, relentless hum above the polished linoleum floors of the Feinberg Pavilion at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Penelope Hayes stood near the heavy oak doors of the VIP cardiac wing, quietly charting her vitals from the previous hour. At 28, Penelope, known to everyone as Penny, was used to being invisible. She was a deeply fat woman in a profession that often prized frantic athletic stamina. At 5'4" and tipping the scales at just over 280 pounds, she was heavily insulated in a world of sharp edges. Her thick thighs chafed under her navy blue scrubs, and her broad, soft stomach pressed against the nursing station counter as she reached for a fresh pen. She was routinely ignored by the handsome trauma surgeons and actively mocked by the slender, hyper-competitive day shift nurses. Head nurse Brenda, a wiry woman with a spray tan and a cruel streak, made it a point to assign Penny to the most grueling, unglamorous tasks. But Penny didn't mind the shadows. She possessed a brilliant clinical mind, a calming, deeply grounded aura, and hands that were incredibly steady. Tonight, however, the shadows were entirely stripped away. The elevator doors at the end of the hall violently chimed open. Chaos erupted. 6 men wearing tailored Italian suits, bulging unnaturally at the ribs where shoulder holsters sat, burst onto the floor. They were dragging a stretcher, flanked by 2 terrified paramedics. "Clear the damn floor," roared a massive man with a broken nose, his hand resting menacingly on the grip of a Glock 19 tucked into his waistband. This was Declan, Arthur Callahan's right-hand man. On the stretcher lay Arthur Callahan himself, even covered in blood. The man was terrifyingly striking. He had sharp, aristocratic features, thick, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and a tailored Bryan shirt that had been shredded to reveal 3 gunshot wounds to his right shoulder and lateral abdomen. But it wasn't the bullets that were causing the most chaos. It was Arthur. Despite rapidly dropping blood pressure, the Mafia boss was thrashing like a cornered apex predator. When an ER doctor reached out to press a gauze pad to his shoulder, Arthur's left arm shot up, his massive hand wrapping around the doctor's wrist, with bone-crushing force. "Don't," Arthur snarled, his voice a growly, demonic rasp. "Don't touch me. Get your hands off me. Mr. Callahan, you are hemorrhaging." Dr. Miller stammered, his face pale with terror. "We need to apply pressure," I said. "Don't touch me." Arthur roared violently, shoving the doctor backward. The mob boss's chest heaved. He was hyperventilating, but not just from blood loss. It was a full-blown panic attack. Penny watched from the nurse's station, her brown eyes widening. The rumors about Arthur Callahan were legendary in Chicago. 11 years ago, his then-fiancée had attempted to assassinate him, poisoning his whiskey with a neurotoxin before setting their penthouse on fire. Arthur had survived, but the toxins and burns left his nervous system irreparably damaged. The physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological ones. He developed extreme HPophobia, a paralyzing, violent fear of being touched. For over a decade, he wore custom leather gloves, long sleeves, and high collars. He cut his own hair. He treated his own minor wounds. No one, not his men, not a woman, not a doctor, had touched his bare skin in 11 years. Sedate him. Head nurse Brenda shrieked from safely behind the reinforced glass of the medication room. "He's allergic to standard sedatives, you idiot," Declan barked, slamming his fist against the nursing station. "His heart will stop. You need to pack the wounds awake." Dr. Miller looked at Brenda, terrified. "I can't get near him." He just dislocated Dr. Evans's finger in the elevator. Brenda's eyes darted around the room, landing on the heavy, unassuming figure of Penelope. A cruel, calculating glint flashed in the head nurse's eyes. If a nurse was going to get assaulted by a Mafia boss, it wasn't going to be Brenda. "Penny?" Brenda snapped, pointing a manicured finger toward the bleeding boss. "Get in there. Handle the packing and vitals." Penny froze. She looked at the violent, bleeding man, then at the 6 armed mobsters, and finally down at her own soft, dimpled hands. She was terrified, but she also saw the monitor. Arthur's oxygen levels were dropping. Beneath the wrath of a ruthless killer, she saw a man drowning in a profound, suffocating panic. Taking a deep breath, her large chest expanding, Penny grabbed a fresh trauma kit. Her heavy footsteps were virtually silent on the linoleum as she walked into the hurricane. "Back off," Arthur hissed as Penny approached the stretcher. His piercing grey eyes were dilated with pain and trauma. He looked like a feral wolf caught in a bear trap, ready to chew off his own limb to escape. Declan stepped in front of Penny. "Listen, sweetheart. He doesn't like being touched. I don't know how you're going to do this, but if you hurt him, I'll put a bullet in your knee." Penny didn't cower. She didn't shrink into herself the way she usually did when insulted about her weight. Something shifted inside her. The maternal, commanding instincts of a trauma nurse took over. She looked Declan dead in the eyes. "If you don't step aside, he's going to bleed out in 4 minutes, and you won't have a boss left to defend," Penny said. Her voice was shockingly calm, a deep, rich alto that resonated in the chaotic room. Declan blinked, taken aback by the sheer authority rolling off the fat, unassuming nurse. Slowly, he stepped aside. Penny moved to Arthur's bedside. He instantly recoiled, pressing his broad, scarred back against the raised mattress. "I'll kill you," he whispered, his chest heaving. "Keep your hands away." Penny didn't lunge with gauze. She didn't bark medical orders. Instead, she stopped 2 feet away from him, Clear's throat. She placed her hands flat on the edge of the metal bed frame, keeping them entirely in his line of sight. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her tone smooth, rhythmic, and incredibly gentle, like a mother calming a frightened horse. "My name is Penelope. I am going to save your life tonight, but I am not going to do anything you don't see coming. I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing before I do it." Arthur stared at her, his jaw locked. Sweat dripped from his dark eyelashes. "I have a sterile gauze pad in my right hand," Penny said softly, lifting the white square so he could see it. "I need to press it against your side. It is going to hurt, but my hand is soft, and I will be as steady as I can. May I?" For 11 years, doctors had tried to ambush him with needles. Women had tried to slip hands under his shirt. No one had ever asked. No one had ever respected the boundary of his trauma. Arthur looked at this woman. She was not like the plastic, sharp-edged models he was used to seeing in his world. She was undeniably fat, her face round and flushed, a double chin resting above her scrub collar. But there was a profound, enveloping warmth radiating from her. Her eyes were deep, soulful amber. For a second, the buzzing in Arthur's ears quieted. He gave a jerky, agonizingly slow nod. "Okay," Penny breathed. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Penny stepped forward and pressed the gauze firmly into the bleeding wound on his abdomen. Arthur gasped, his entire body going rigid. The instinct to strike out, to violently reject the human contact, flared in his brain. But as Penny's bare fingers brushed the uninjured skin of his stomach, the panic abruptly stalled. Her hands were incredibly soft. They were warm, heavy, and undeniably safe. For a decade, every accidental brush of skin felt like burning acid to Arthur's damaged nerves. But Penny's touch didn't burn. Her flesh, pillowy and gentle, acted like a grounding wire to his short-circuiting nervous system. Arthur let out a shuddering breath, his head dropping back against the pillow. The heart monitor, which had been screeching an erratic tachycardia rhythm, began to steadily slow down. Beep, beep, beep. Declan and the other mobsters stood in stunned, absolute silence. Dr. Miller's jaw was practically on the floor. "You're doing perfectly, Arthur," Penny murmured, instinctively dropping his formal title. She leaned closer, her soft, large breasts brushing against his uninjured arm as she reached across to check the shoulder wound. Usually, she was deeply self-conscious of her size, apologizing for taking up space. But right now, her substantial weight and softness were a physical anchor, keeping Arthur tethered to reality. "The shoulder is a through and through," Penny announced to the room, not breaking eye contact with Arthur. "Dr. Miller, I have the bleeding controlled. You can come in and suture, but I am keeping my hands on him. If you move quickly, he won't fight you." Arthur's grey eyes were locked onto Penny's round face, his breathing synchronized with hers. "Don't let go," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm right here," Penny promised, her thumb gently stroking the skin near his collarbone. "I've got you." For the next 2 hours, while surgeons stitched and cleaned the wounds, Penny Hayes did not move an inch. She absorbed the Mafia boss's pain, acting as a human shield against the ghosts of his trauma. And Arthur Callahan, the untouchable ghost of Chicago, realized he never wanted her hands to leave him. 3 days passed. Arthur was transferred to room 412, a sprawling, secure corner suite on the VIP floor. The entire corridor had been bought out by the Callahan Syndicate. Suited men with earpieces stood at the elevators, stairwells, and outside Arthur's door. Inside the hospital, a new, bizarre hierarchy had formed. Arthur had issued a strict, terrifying mandate to the hospital administration. No one enters the room except Penelope, Head nurse Brenda had tried to intervene, citing hospital protocol and shift limits, eager to put her thinner, more presentable nurses in front of the billionaire mobster. Declan had simply placed a massive hand on Brenda's desk, leaned down, and whispered, "If anyone other than Penelope walks through that door, I will burn this hospital to the ground, with you inside it." So Penny essentially moved into room 412. The dynamic between the ruthless kingpin and the overweight night nurse shifted rapidly from medical necessity to profound emotional intimacy. Arthur was a terrible patient, stubborn, easily irritated, and prone to dark moods. But the moment Penny walked into the room, his entire demeanor changed. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The room was illuminated only by the soft glow of the telemetry monitors and a small reading lamp. Penny sat in a plush armchair next to his bed. She was exhausted. She had her thick legs curled under her reading a paperback novel, occasionally glancing up at the monitors. "You're reading in the dark." Arthur's growly voice broke the silence. Penny looked up, closing the book over her thick finger. "You're supposed to be asleep. The pain meds should have knocked you out an hour ago." "I don't sleep well," Arthur said. He turned his head on the pillow, his piercing grey eyes studying her. He had spent the last 3 days watching her. He watched how she moved gracefully, despite her heavy frame. He noticed how she tried to hide her stomach by crossing her arms, how she wore a scrub jacket 2 sizes too big to mask her wide hips. He saw the deep insecurities that the world had beaten into her. Yet when she touched him to change his bandages, she was a goddess of mercy and confidence. "Come here," Arthur commanded softly. Penny hesitated, then set her book down. She walked over to the side of the bed. "Do you need water? Are you hurting?" "Give me your hand," he said. Penny's breath hitched. Usually, she initiated the necessary medical touches, always warning him first. Slowly, she extended her plump, soft hand. Arthur reached out with his uninjured left arm. He didn't have his leather glove on. His large, heavily calloused hand wrapped around hers. A jolt of pure electricity shot up Penny's arm. Arthur closed his eyes, exhaling a long, jagged breath as he pulled her hand to his chest, resting it right over his heart. "For 11 years?" Arthur murmured, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "I felt like I was burning alive every time someone got near me. It was like acid on my skin. I forgot what it felt like to be human." He opened his eyes, looking up at her round, flushed face. "Why doesn't it hurt when you touch me, Penny?" Penny swallowed hard, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. Maybe, because I know what it's like to want to be invisible," she whispered honestly. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Arthur." Arthur reached up with his thumb, gently brushing a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed her plump cheek. "You shouldn't want to be invisible. You're the most beautiful thing I've seen in a decade." Penny's heart pounded against her ribs. She took a step back, breaking the contact, her insecurities flaring. "Arthur, please don't mock me. I know what I look like. I know who I am. And I know who you are. You don't know a damn thing about how I see you," Arthur said, his tone turning fiercely protective. Before Penny could respond, the heavy wooden door of the suite clicked open. Penny turned, expecting Declan, Instead, a tall man wearing standard blue surgical scrubs, a surgical cap, and a white mask stepped into the room. He pushed a small medication cart. "Routine IV check," the man mumbled, his voice muffled by the mask. He kept his head down, moving swiftly toward the IV pole on the far side of Arthur's bed. Penny frowned. Her clinical mind immediately flagged several anomalies. First, no one but her was allowed in here. Second, this man wasn't wearing the standard Northwestern Memorial Badge lanyard. He had a generic clip-on ID that looked like it belonged to the outpatient cardiology clinic. Third, his eyes were locked on Arthur, not the monitors. As the man reached into his scrub pocket, he pulled out a syringe. The fluid inside was clear, but the label on the barrel caught the dim light. Potassium chloride. Undiluted. A lethal dose that would cause an instant, untraceable heart attack. "Hey!" Penny shouted. "Stop. What is that?" The assassin realized he was made. He lunged toward Arthur, uncapping the needle, aiming straight for the Mafia boss's IV port. Arthur, heavily medicated and nursing a gunshot wound to his dominant side, couldn't move fast enough to defend himself. Penny didn't think. She didn't call for the guards. Her body moved entirely on instinct, throwing her entire 280-pound frame forward. Penny intercepted the assassin. She slammed into the man with the force of a freight train. The sheer weight and momentum of her body caught the hitman completely off guard. He was slammed backward, crashing violently into the heavy metal medication cart. The syringe flew out of his hand, shattering against the linoleum floor. The assassin roared, drawing a suppressed pistol from his waistband. But Penny didn't stop. Operating on pure adrenaline, she grabbed the heavy metal IV pole and swung the weighted base directly into the assassin's knees. The man buckled with a sickening crunch. Before he could raise the gun, Penny threw her entire weight onto him, pinning his gun arm to the floor beneath her knee. The sharp pain in her own joints entirely eclipsed by her desperate need to protect Arthur. "Declan!" Penny screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the quiet ward. "Gun! In here!" The door burst off its hinges. Declan and 3 mobsters swarmed the room. Within 2 seconds, the assassin was disarmed, blooded, and dragged up by his neck. 2 Glocks pressed firmly against his temples. Penny scrambled backward, her chest heaving, her scrubs disheveled. She was shaking violently, the adrenaline crashing in her system. She looked at the floor, where the shattered remains of the lethal potassium chloride lay in a puddle. Arthur pushed himself up on his good elbow, ignoring the agonizing tearing of his fresh stitches. His grey eyes were entirely feral as he looked at the assassin. "Take him to the basement," Arthur commanded Declan, his voice a lethal, frozen whisper. "Find out who sent him, then take him apart." Slowly, Declan nodded grimly, dragging the thrashing hitman out of the room. The door shut, leaving Arthur and Penny alone once more. Penny collapsed into the armchair, burying her round face in her soft hands, sobbing from the sheer terror of what had just happened. Arthur gritted his teeth, forcing his battered body to move. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and despite the agony, stood up. He walked slowly across the floor, his bare feet silent. He knelt in front of her chair. For a man who had commanded Epias, who had struck terror into the hearts of thousands, bowing before anyone, was unthinkable, but he knelt before Penelope Hayes. Arthur reached out, wrapping his large, scarred arms securely around her thick waist, burying his face in the soft, warm curve of her stomach. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice trembling as he held on to her like a drowning man clutching a life raft. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet for me." Penny dropped her hands, looking down at the terrifying Mafia boss, kneeling at her feet, clinging to her heavy body as if she were a goddess. She slowly ran her fingers through his dark hair. "I told you," Penny sobbed softly. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Arthur looked up, his grey eyes blazing with a frightening, beautiful intensity. "You're mine now, Penelope. I don't care about the hospital. I don't care about your doubts. You are never leaving my side again." 4 days later, Arthur Callahan discharged himself from Northwestern Memorial against every shred of medical advice. He didn't leave in a standard wheelchair. He walked out through the private underground loading dock, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men, his jaw clenched against the agonizing pull of his fresh sutures. Walking directly beside him, no longer wearing her navy blue hospital scrubs, was Penelope Hayes. She had resigned from her nursing position that morning. Head nurse Brenda had tried to threaten Penny with a breach of contract, screaming that she would blackball her from every hospital in Illinois. Declan had calmly stepped into Brenda's office, placed a sleek black briefcase containing $200,000 in unmarked bills on her desk, and softly suggested that Brenda lose Penny's employment file immediately. Brenda took the money. Now Penny was stepping into a bulletproof Mercedes Maybach, leaving the only world she had ever known. Arthur's primary residence was the massive $70 million penthouse occupying the top floors of the St. Regis, Chicago, an architectural marvel of glass and steel overlooking Lake Michigan and the Chicago River. When the private elevator doors opened into the sprawling, sun-drenched foyer, Penny felt overwhelmingly out of place. The floors were imported Italian marble, the walls adorned with genuine modern art, and the staff wore impeccably tailored uniforms. Penny stood in the center of the living room, clutching her cheap canvas tote bag against her heavy stomach. She was wearing her most presentable clothes, a pair of stretchy black slacks and a flowy maroon tunic that she bought at a plus-size outlet in the suburbs. In this pristine billionaire's sanctuary, she felt massive, clumsy, and entirely inadequate. Arthur, sensing her sudden spike in anxiety, dismissed his security detail with a sharp flick of his wrist. He walked over to her, his movement stiff but purposeful, and gently pulled the canvas bag from her hands, dropping it to the floor. "You're shaking," Arthur said, his deep voice softening into that low, rhythmic cadence he reserved only for her. "Oh, I don't belong here, Arthur," Penny whispered, wrapping her thick arms around her torso in a defensive posture. "Look around. Look at this place. Look at your life. I'm a fat, exhausted night nurse who eats cold vending machine sandwiches at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm not a Mafia boss's girl. I don't fit in this world." Arthur's grey eyes darkened. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that would have sent him into a panic attack just a week ago. He reached out, his large hands sliding under her arms, to pull her flush against his solid chest. He didn't care about the pain in his shoulder. He only cared about the warmth of her body pressing against his. "You think I want someone who fits into this world?" Arthur growled softly, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "This world is a toxic, rotting cesspool of plastic women and treacherous men. For 11 years, everyone who looked at me either wanted to use my money or put a bullet in my head. You are the only real, breathing, beautiful thing in my life. You don't have to fit into my world, Penelope. I am building a new one around you." To prove his point, Arthur summoned Chicago's most elite personal shoppers directly to the St. Regis the next afternoon. He refused to let Penny hide in oversized, shapeless garments anymore. Representatives from Neiman Marcus on Michigan Avenue arrived with racks of custom luxury clothing specifically tailored for her voluptuous figure. It was during this fitting that the reality of Arthur's terrifying protective streak fully manifested. A senior stylist named Beatrice, a gaunt, razor-thin woman with severe cheekbones, was pinning a stunning emerald green silk dress around Penny's waist. Beatrice clicked her tongue in annoyance. "It's just so difficult," Beatrice muttered under her breath, loud enough for Penny to hear. "Silk is notoriously unforgiving on substantial adipose tissue. Perhaps a darker color to create a slimming illusion. We really need to hide these problem areas." Penny's face flushed crimson. She immediately tried to step out of the dress, the familiar crushing weight of lifelong humiliation crashing down on her shoulders. "She's right," Penny stammered, tears stinging her eyes. "I should just wear black." Arthur had been sitting on a velvet sofa across the room, reviewing financial documents on a tablet. At Beatrix's comment, the room went terrifyingly cold. Arthur set the tablet down. The silence was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the penthouse. He stood up and walked slowly toward the stylist. Beatrice froze, suddenly realizing she had just insulted the chosen companion of the most dangerous man in the Midwest. "Mr. Callahan? I only meant," Beatrice stammered, taking a terrified step backward. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at Beatrice with the cold, dead eyes of a cartel executioner. "Leave the clothes. Leave the pins. Walk out of my home. If I ever hear your name in the city of Chicago again, if I ever find out you are employed at a boutique within a 500-mile radius of my woman, Declan will make sure you disappear. Do you understand?" Beatrice burst into tears, nodded frantically, and practically sprinted for the elevator, leaving her assistants paralyzed in fear. Arthur dismissed them with a sharp nod, and they scrambled out, leaving Penny and Arthur alone in the massive dressing room. Arthur turned to Penny. She was trembling in the emerald silk, her large, soft breasts heaving, her thick thighs pressing against the luxurious fabric. Arthur walked up to her, his gaze dropping heavily to her stomach, her hips, and the soft curve of her jaw. He didn't see problem areas. He saw a sanctuary. He fell to his knees in front of her. Gently, reverently, he pressed his face against her soft, rounded stomach, wrapping his arms around her thick waist. "There is nothing to hide," he whispered against the silk. "Every inch of you is soft and warm and perfect. You saved me. Let me worship you." For the first time in her 28 years, Penelope Hayes felt truly undeniably beautiful. She sank her fingers into Arthur's dark hair, pulling him closer, letting the tears fall. Not from shame, but from absolute overwhelming relief. Weeks turned into a month, and the bond between the hardened criminal kingpin and the gentle trauma nurse became legendary within the Chicago syndicate. Penny was no longer a secret. She was Arthur's shadow, his confidant, and the only person who could touch him. Arthur's HPophobia was entirely eradicated, but strictly localized to her. He still wore his leather gloves in public. He still snapped the wrists of men who bumped into him. But behind the closed doors of the St. Regis, he craved Penny's skin with a ravenous, desperate addiction. However, the world Arthur commanded was not one that allowed for peaceful honeymoons. The assassin at the hospital had been just the first move in a much larger chess game. Under enhanced interrogation in a soundproof basement, the hitman had finally broken. He confessed that the hit had been orchestrated by Dominic Rousseau, the head of the rival outfit faction operating out of the West Loop. Dominic was an old-school mobster, deeply insulted by Arthur's modernization of the Chicago underworld. He had planned to wipe Arthur out and absorb his assets. Declan brought the intelligence to Arthur while Penny was reading on the balcony. Rousseau requested a sit-down, Declan reported, handing Arthur an encrypted phone. He's claiming innocence, says the hitman acted alone. A rogue element. He wants to meet on neutral ground to clear the air and negotiate a peace treaty. Tomorrow night, the Drake Hotel, private dining room in the Cape Cod room. Arthur stared at the screen, a predatory smirk twisting his lips. It's a trap. Dominic isn't smart enough to orchestrate a hospital hit without leaving a trail. He wants to finish the job in public to prove to the commission that I'm weak. Do we strike first? Declan asked, his hand instinctively dropping to his holster. No, Arthur replied, his voice chillingly calm. We go to the meeting. We let him think he has the upper hand, and we crush his entire operation in one night. Arthur paused, looking out toward the balcony where Penny was bathed in the late afternoon sun. I want extra details on all exits, and Penny is coming with me. Declan blinked, shocked. Boss, if it's a trap, bringing her is a massive risk. She's civilian. She's not trained for a firefight. I am never letting her out of my sight again, Arthur stated, leaving absolutely no room for debate. She stays by my side. My personal shield detail will surround her. If anyone so much as looks at her wrong, you shoot them in the face. The next evening, the atmosphere at the Drake Hotel was thick with unspoken tension. The opulent historic hotel on the Gold Coast was teeming with suited men trying desperately to look like regular businessmen, their coats bulging with heavy artillery. Penny walked through the gilded lobby, her hand firmly gripped in Arthur's gloved one. She was wearing the emerald green silk dress tailored perfectly to her lush curves. She looked regal, commanding, and absolutely terrifying in her own right. Fueled by the unwavering confidence Arthur had poured into her over the past month. They entered the private dining room. Dominic Rousseau sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by 4 massive enforcers. Dominic was a greasy, aging man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl. His eyes immediately darted to Penny, dragging up and down her heavy frame with naked, insulting judgment. Arthur, Dominic sneered, his voice dripping with faux congeniality. "Glad you're walking. Heard you had a rough night at Northwestern. And who is this, eh? Your dietary consultant?" The insult hung in the air. Dominic's men chuckled. Arthur didn't react. He calmly pulled out a heavy oak chair for Penny, waiting until she was seated before taking the chair next to her. Only then did Arthur look at Dominic. "This is Penelope," Arthur said smoothly, removing his right leather glove, exposing his bare, scarred hand. He reached over and placed his hand gently on Penny's plump thigh, intertwining his fingers with hers beneath the table. "She is the woman who saved my life. And she's the reason you are breathing right now, Dominic. Because if she hadn't taught me an ounce, Clear's throat of mercy, over the last month, I would have sent your severed head to your wife in a FedEx box yesterday." Dominic's smile vanished. He shifted uncomfortably. "I told your men I had nothing to do with that hit. It was rogue." "Save it," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I know about the wire transfers to the assassin's brother in Detroit. I know you paid $3 million to see me dead." Dominic's face flushed purple. He realized the gig was up. He slammed his fist on the table. "You're a Arthur. You're a paranoid freak who can't even shake another man's hand. You don't deserve this city." Dominic reached inside his jacket, a signal to his men. But Arthur was 10 steps ahead. Before Dominic's hand even touched the grip of his weapon, Arthur kicked the heavy mahogany table upward with bone-shattering force. The massive piece of furniture flipped, crashing into Dominic and pinning him against the wall. At the exact same second, Declan and Arthur's men drew their suppressed weapons. Thip, thip, thip. 3 of Dominic's enforcers dropped to the carpeted floor, instantly neutralized. The 4th enforcer, however, was faster. He dove behind a serving cart, raising an automatic MAC-10 toward Arthur. Arthur lunged, throwing his body entirely over Penny, shielding her soft, vulnerable frame with his own back. Gunfire erupted, shattering the antique mirrors and destroying the crystal chandeliers above them. Glass rained down on Arthur's back. He grunted as a stray bullet grazed his already injured shoulder, but he didn't budge. He kept Penny pinned securely beneath him, his face buried in the soft curve of her neck. "Arthur, you're bleeding," Penny screamed over the deafening roar of the gunfire, her medical instincts kicking in immediately. She tried to push him off to assess the wound, her hands sliding over his ruined suit jacket. "Stay down," Arthur roared, his grip on her ironclad. "I've got you, my love. I've got you." The firefight lasted less than 12 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Declan stepped forward, kicking the MAC-10 away from the dead enforcer. Dominic Russo was trapped beneath the overturned table, whimpering with a shattered collarbone. Utterly defeated, Arthur slowly pulled himself off Penny. He looked down at her, checking her face, her arms, and her chest frantically. "Are you hurt? Penny, talk to me. Are you hit?" Penny sat up, her chest heaving. She looked at the carnage around her, the dead bodies, the bleeding mob boss in front of her. Most women would have completely broken down in hysterics, but Penelope Hayes was a trauma nurse. Blood and chaos were her native language. She just hadn't spoken outside a hospital until now. She reached up, tearing a long strip of fabric from the hem of her expensive emerald dress. She wrapped it tightly around Arthur's bleeding shoulder, tying it off with professional, ruthless efficiency. "I'm fine," Penny said, her amber eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire as she looked at Arthur. She grabbed his face with her soft, heavy hands, pulling him down until their foreheads rested against each other. "But if you ever try to take a bullet for me again without asking, I swear to God, Arthur Callahan, I will kill you myself." Arthur stared at her, breathing heavily, completely overwhelmed by the magnificent, terrifying, beautiful woman he had claimed. He let out a dark, rich laugh, kissing her deeply right there in the middle of the blood-soaked dining room. The Chicago outfit had just changed leadership, but it wasn't Arthur Callahan who truly ruled the city anymore. It was the chubby, unstoppable nurse from the night shift. Tension radiated through the underground boardroom of the Callahan Syndicate's West Loop warehouse, thick enough to choke on. 2 weeks had passed since the massacre at the Drake Hotel, and the power vacuum left by Dominic Russo's demise had drawn out the oldest, most venomous sharks in Chicago's criminal underworld. 6 regional KPOs sat around the sprawling slate table, their faces stony, their tailored suits doing little to hide their predatory instincts. They were waiting for Arthur, expecting a weakened, bleeding boss. Instead, the heavy steel doors swung open and Penelope Hayes walked in. She did not shrink. She did not attempt to camouflage her 280-pound frame. Clad in a bespoke, high-waisted burgundy pencil skirt and a sharply tailored black silk blouse that accentuated her massive, heavy breasts and wide hips, Penny looked like a formidable queen stepping onto a battlefield. Her thick thighs brushed together with a quiet, commanding swish of expensive fabric as she bypassed the guest chairs and walked directly to the head of the table. Arthur followed a step behind her. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit, his right arm resting comfortably in a custom silk sling, his left hand resting securely, proudly on the curve of Penny's lower back. He pulled out the heavy leather boss's chair, not for himself, but for her. As Penny sat, the room collectively held its breath. Arthur took a secondary chair to her right, signaling a shift in the hierarchy that sent shock waves through the hardened criminals. "What is this, Arthur?" barked Richard Ali, a silver-haired capo who controlled the docks. He sneered, his eyes dragging over Penny's round face and double chin with undisguised contempt. "We called a sit-down to discuss the Russo territories and the supply chain disruptions. We didn't come here to play house with your overweight night nurse. This is a civilian, a liability. Get her out of the room so the men can work." Declan, standing in the corner, immediately reached for his weapon, but Arthur held up a single calm finger. The boss didn't look angry. He looked amused. He leaned back, turning his grey eyes entirely to Penny. Penny folded her plump, soft hands on the slate table. Her amber eyes locked onto Ali, and the deep, motherly warmth that usually radiated from her was replaced by the freezing, clinical detachment of a trauma ward triaging a hopeless case. "Mr. Ali," Penny began, her rich alto voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You are currently sweating through a bespoke Brian suit in a room that is set to precisely 68 degrees. Your breathing is shallow, your lips have a faint cyanotic tint, and you've rubbed your left jaw 3 times in the last 10 minutes. O'Malley stiffened, his hand freezing halfway to his face. "What the hell are Clear's throat you talking about, sweetheart?" "I am talking about the Widowmaker heart attack you are currently brewing," Penny said, with absolute terrifying calm. "Your left anterior descending artery is likely 90% blocked. You are exhibiting classic signs of acute myocardial ischemia. If you don't get a nitroglycerin patch and a beta blocker into your system within the next 20 minutes, your heart will stop right there in that chair." The boardroom fell into a stunned, deathly silence. The other capos stared at Ali, who was suddenly looking incredibly pale, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Now," Penny continued, her heavy gaze sweeping the room, demanding the attention of every ruthless killer at the table, "you all think I am a liability because I am fat, because I am soft, because I don't carry a gun. But I understand the human body better than any butcher in this room. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to collapse a trachea. I know exactly which paralytic drugs mimic a natural stroke perfectly, leaving 0 trace in a coroner's toxicology report. I know how to keep a man alive through agonizing pain. And I know exactly how to end him without spilling a single drop of blood." "Oh," she leaned forward, her substantial breasts resting on the edge of the table, her presence commanding and absolute. "Arthur Callahan's health, his empire, and his life belong to me. If any of you question his authority or my place beside him, I will not bother sending Declan to shoot you. I will simply slip a potassium chloride cocktail into your morning espresso, and your wives will collect your life insurance by dinner. Do we understand each other?" Ali clutched his chest, gasping for air as the panic exacerbated his actual medical condition. He nodded frantically, his arrogance entirely shattered by the terrifying, clinically precise threat delivered by the soft-spoken woman. "Declan," Penny commanded, not breaking eye contact with the room. "Have the medics waiting in the garage prep a sublingual nitro for Mr. Ali and drive him to Northwestern. Use the VIP entrance. Tell Dr. Miller it's a favor from Penelope." "Yes, Mum," Declan said, his voice ringing with absolute profound respect. He practically dragged the gasping capo out of the room. The remaining 5 KPOs sat rigidly in their chairs, terrified to even breathe wrong. Arthur leaned over, his grey eyes blazing with a dark, obsessive hunger as he looked at his woman. Without a word of hesitation, he pulled his leather glove off with his teeth, spat it onto the table, and pressed his bare, calloused hand over Penny's soft, plump fingers in front of the Enton Syndicate. "Now," Arthur said, a predatory smile stretching across his scarred face, "my queen has cleared the agenda. Let's discuss the Russo territories." Winter hit Chicago with a brutal, howling vengeance. The windows of the St. Regis penthouse were frosted over, framing the city skyline in glittering ice. Inside, however, the temperature was a perfect, comforting oasis. 6 months had passed since Penny took her seat at the boardroom table, and the underworld of Chicago had never been more fiercely loyal or terrifyingly efficient. Penny's unique blend of medical expertise and profound empathy had entirely reshaped Arthur's syndicate. Men who were injured in the line of duty no longer bled out in dirty back alley clinics. Penny established a state-of-the-art underground trauma center, earning the absolute undying devotion of the foot soldiers. She was universally referred to as La Madre, the mother. To disrespect her was a death sentence, not just from Arthur, but from every single enforcer on the payroll. Yet, despite her absolute triumph over the city, the true victory lay in the quiet, intimate sanctuary of the penthouse bedroom. It was late December. The fire was roaring in the marble hearth, casting dancing golden light across the massive king-sized bed. Penny lay on her side, her thick, luscious curves draped only in a thin silk sheet. Her soft, dimpled thighs were tangled with Arthur's lean, muscular legs. Arthur's recovery had been miraculous. The paralyzing hypophobia that had tortured him for 11 years was a ghost of the past, entirely exorcised by Penny's unwavering patience. But tonight, a new threshold was being crossed. Earlier that week, Arthur had undergone a specialized, highly dangerous nerve graft surgery to repair the final remnants of the damage on his right side, the very side where his former fiancée had burned him. Penny had scrubbed in alongside the city's top neurosurgeon, guiding the delicate procedure herself. Now Arthur lay beside her, the bandages freshly removed from his torso. "Does it hurt?" Penny whispered, her amber eyes scanning his heavily scarred chest. She reached out, her plump, warm hand hovering just millimeters above his skin. Arthur caught her wrist gently. "Stop asking," he murmured. He didn't pull her hand to his uninjured left side like he usually did. Instead, he pressed her soft palm directly against the jagged, twisted, burned scars on his right shoulder and ribs, the dead zone that used to send him into agonizing convulsions. Penny held her breath, her eyes widening. She waited for the flinch. She waited for the panic attack, the rapid heartbeat, the sudden withdrawal. Nothing happened. Arthur let out a long, shuddering exhale, closing his eyes as a profound peace washed over his sharp features. He didn't feel the burning acid of his trauma. He just felt her. He felt the heavy, comforting warmth of her flesh. He felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of her heart echoing through her fingertips. "I can feel you," Arthur whispered, a tear slipping out from beneath his dark eyelashes, cutting a path through the dangerous angles of his face. "Penny, I can feel you. It doesn't hurt. It just feels like coming home." Penny sobbed softly, a beautiful, joyous sound that filled the cavernous room. She shifted her heavy body closer, wrapping her thick arms securely around his neck, pressing her large, soft breasts flush against his chest. She kissed his jaw, his cheek, the corner of his mouth, pouring every ounce of her love into the hardened killer who treated her like a goddess. Arthur rolled over, pinning her gently to the mattress. His bare hands mapped the vast, beautiful expanse of her body. He traced the deep curves of her wide hips, the soft, generous swell of her stomach, the thick, powerful thighs that grounded him to the earth. He ripped every stretch mark, every dimple, kissing the skin that the world had told her to hide. "You are my cure," Arthur murmured fiercely against her lips, his hands tangling in her brown hair. "You gave me my life back, and tomorrow I am giving you my name." The next evening, The grand ballroom of the Palmer House, Hilton, was locked down by a security detail tighter than a presidential motorcade. No press, no civilians, only the elite inner circle of the Callahan Syndicate. Penny stood in front of the gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror in the bridal suite, tears of pure joy streaming down her round, flushed cheeks. She was not wearing a shapeless slimming gown designed to hide her body. She was wearing a breathtaking, custom-made Vera Wang masterpiece of ivory lace and heavy satin. The dress featured a plunging sweetheart neckline that proudly displayed her magnificent cleavage, a corseted bodice that hugged her thick waist, and a dramatic sweeping train that made her look like royalty. Declan, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, knocked softly on the doorframe. The massive enforcer, a man who had ended dozens of lives without blinking, actually dabbed at his eyes with a silk handkerchief when he saw her. "It's time, boss," Declan said gently, extending his arm to escort her. Penny took his arm, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her head held high. As the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open, the string quartet began to play a hauntingly beautiful acoustic rendition of "Can't Help Falling in Love." Every capo, every enforcer, every dangerous man in the room rose to their feet, bowing their heads in deep, terrifyingly sincere reverence as La Madre walked down the aisle. But Penny only saw Arthur standing at the altar, stripped of his leather gloves. Arthur looked at his bride with a devotion so fierce it could have burned the city down. When Penny finally reached him, Arthur didn't wait for the priest to begin. He reached out with both bare hands, pulling her thick, beautiful waist against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck in front of the entire underworld. "Mine," Arthur whispered, "a vow more binding than any ring." "Yours," Penny breathed back, her soft hands anchoring him exactly where he belonged. The untouchable ghost of Chicago had finally been caught, and he was never ever letting go. Penelope Hayes stepped into the most dangerous, unforgiving world imaginable, and conquered it not with bullets, but with unyielding compassion and profound confidence in her own skin. Arthur Callahan built an empire on fear, but it was Penny's soft, grounding touch that turned that empire into an unbreakable dynasty. She proved that true strength isn't about fitting into society's narrow molds. It's about embracing exactly who you are and demanding the world make room for you. If you loved this story of unexpected romance, intense Mafia drama, and a plus-sized queen claiming her throne, smash that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a badass heroine. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling original audio stories. Let us know in the comments what kind of story you want to hear.